Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. In this episode I'll be making a segmented hollow form with an interesting pattern. I cannot take any credit for coming up with the idea. I've seen it on YouTube and I just wanted to have a go at doing it for myself. So let's get started. Bit of a different start this time round. I began with jointing and thicknessing the timber before moving on to the circular saw to cut it down to the required sizes. This is a Metabo jointer thicknesser and it's a great piece of kit. I've used it on several of my previous projects, but it's quite big and difficult to film, but I included it in this video. The first segments to be cut are for the top section, and this time the rings will have 12 segments, each cut with a 15-degree angle. For this pattern the number of segments needs to be divided equally by 4, so a 15 or an 18 segment ring would not work for this project. Once again, the inaccuracy in my mitre fence has let the side down, so I'll have to resort to sanding a couple of segments down on the large disc sander. Very annoying. I guess with a bit of planning I could make an accurate mitre sled and not have these issues cropping up time and again. A quick markup on 2 segments, and I sanded each one down to adjust the angle to get a more or less perfect fit. And there you go, no more gaps. The glue up is the same as in my other projects, using Type Bond 2, getting plenty on the end grain, and of course, making sure to sand the rough edges off the segments first. The segments are about 70mm deep, so after the glue up I used 2 band clamps just to make sure the joints were nice and tight. To assist with mounting the top ring to the lathe, I decided to infill the hole in the middle with a piece of MDF. This was also supposed to enable me to fix the jig to set out the pattern. But as you will see, I decided to forgo that and try a different method, which didn't work out as well as it should. Once the top ring was glued up and clamped, I ran some more oak and padauk through the jointer thicknesser. This hollow form project has 5 segmental rings with a solid base and top piece. Next, it's cutting the timber down to the required sizes to complete the remaining rings. Now a word about this table saw. I don't mind using it, but I have to say that of all the powered machinery I have, this one I have the most respect for. On a number of occasions I've had kickbacks, and always when I least expected it. So I've taken the plunge and I've invested in a larger bandsaw, which I feel will be safer to use. Matt Easley made a great video on this exact topic, in which he explains why he does not own a table saw and I have to say, I agree with his reasons. If you haven't already, it's worth checking out his channel. These pieces will form the centre feature ring just under the top ring, and again glued with Type Bond 2 and firmly clamped and left overnight to set up. The next day, and with the clamps removed, I passed the two pieces through the sander to make them a uniform depth. They were then put to one side. I marked out the top ring for the first 4 of 12 eventual cuts used to form the main feature pattern. This is where I made my first big mistake on this feature pattern. I decided I could eyeball the set out for each of the 3 separate sets of 4 cuts. What I should have done is use the correctly sized square template with a hole dead centre screwed into the centre point of the top ring. One of the reasons I glued the MDF into the top ring was so that I could establish an accurate centre point. I couldn't think of a safe way to hold the top ring for use on the table saw, so I decided to use the bandsaw. I figured I only needed to keep the saw cut between the 2 lines, and I could sand down to the lines with a large disc sander. The oak turned out to be much tougher to sand down than I had imagined, but with a bit of perseverance I managed to get it down to the line, and it turned out to be very accurate. I won't bore you with the full sanding, but I had to repeat this on all 4 sides and the 4 offcuts. The idea was to remove the same thickness of material as the Padauk strip. Sanding done, I then had to miter the Padauk strips to accurately fit around the 4 sides. With all the pieces cut, all there was left to do was glue it all back together. Fairly straightforward, but the clamping took some doing. I didn't show it all, but I got there in the end. With the top ring put to one side to dry overnight, I cut the remaining segments. I'm not going to show too much of this, but it's the same as before, though this time I had taken more time to set up the mitre fence. After sanding the remaining segments, I assembled the centre feature ring. I should have filmed it in more detail as I put it together, but you'll see it in a short while. I got lucky with the next rings, the mitres all worked out, so no more sanding to make them fit, which made me very happy. But I'm still going to make an adjustable mitre sled. At the time of editing this, we have a bank holiday coming up, so no more excuses. There are 4 more rings to assemble, but this is the last one I'll show. And so, after 24 hours to let the glue set up, I passed the rings through the drum sander to get them all nice and level. Sanding done on the lower rings, I then moved on to sanding the top feature ring. I just had to remove the high spots on this one so I could mark out the next set of cuts. For the next markup, I had cut a piece of MDF to assist, but I still thought I could eyeball the position, and for a start it all looked okay, so it was back to the bandsaw, only this time I made 2 cuts on each side, much closer to the lines, to try and cut down on the sanding, and it worked. I won't show me cutting all 4 sides, but as you can see, the bandsaw was able to cut very close to the lines, but if I do this again, I will cut the outer of the 2 lines first. Smaller offcuts were a bit tricky to hold and push through the blade. A much quicker sanding on all 4 sides and the offcuts. Then I cut and mitered the Purdue strips and glued it all back together the same as before. The clamps did a good job at holding the pieces together, but things were sliding around a fair bit. But once I got everything aligned, it was okay. It seems obvious now. I should have just used hose clamps. That would have been much easier. Oh well, there's always next time. Whilst the top section was drying, I glued the lower section rings together, all nice and easy, using hot melt glue to hold everything in place and a full gallon of Tight Bond 2 to add weight to squeeze it all nice and snug. I've chosen not to show me doing the last 4 cuts to the top section. It was all done the same as the second time, using the MDF square to mark it out, the bandsaw to cut through, all sanded, 4 pieces of Purdue cut to fit, and all glued back together. You can see the finished rough pattern as it passes through the sander. Finally some wood turning after all that preparation to get to this stage. Mounted in the lathe using a 10N in the 4-jaw chuck, I went to work forming the shape of the outside. I only wanted to remove some weight and roughly shape the outer part. The main point of this is to shape the inside ready for the top to be glued on. Shaping the inside was a nice easy process, and for once the rings were well balanced, so there was not a lot of vibration to deal with. I went at the inside with a 1/2-inch bowl gouge, gently taking out material to get down to the final shape. I also used the carbide cutter in the tighter angles and blended and faired the surface with the negative rate scraper. And with the inside done, I sanded from 80 to 320 grit and cleaned the fine dust away with denatured alcohol, applied a generous coat of sanding sealer and denibbed with wire wool. Up next, Yorkshire grit abrasive paste, cleaned away with paper towel. And to finish, wood wax 22, 2 coats to seal the surface. But now the lower section is done, so we moved on to the top section. After marking the centre, I drilled a 6mm hole for the woodworm screw, then I mounted it onto the lathe. This is the same as for the lower section. I only need to roughly shape the outside, but the inside needs hollowing out and finishing so I can glue the two halves together. Off camera, I glued a piece of padoot to the top to form the rim. This would also give me something to drill a hole into to mount it to the woodworm screw. And with it firmly secured, I could hollow out the top section. Again, a very straightforward process, the same as before, using the 1/2-inch bowl gouge to do most of the work and finishing off with a negative rate scraper. This is turning into a long video, but I hope you will stick around to the end. And whilst you're here, would you please subscribe? I really want to make a success of this channel, and your subscription will help to make the channel grow. And leave a comment. I always like to hear from people that watch these episodes, and a thumbs up is always welcome. Oh, and please share any of my videos. That will help to spread the word. And thank you very much, and back to the video. final sanding, and that's the inside done. Quick wipe down with denatured alcohol, followed by sanding sealer denibbed in the usual way, Yorkshire grit for a final smoothing, and wood wax 22 to finish and seal the surface. With the inside of both halves finished, I could glue them together, which I did whilst it was mounted in the lathe. A great way to keep everything nice and centred, using the tailstock to apply plenty of clamping pressure. It's a few days later and I finally got to turning the outside to the finished shape. Beginning with the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, I could gently start to remove material. The rim required a fair bit of shaping. For this I used a 1/4 inch parting tool to do the undercut and a 3/8 bowl gouge to form the main shape, with a bit of help from the parting tool to cut the hole and the skew chisel to blend it all in, then a final shaping with a negative rate scraper. Of sanding to remove the tool marks, and I used the timber caul and the tailstock to add support before moving on to blending and fairing the outside. The base section needed some shaping, so for that I used the Easy Wood Tools carbide cutter to get into the tighter curves, followed up with a bit more fine tuning around the lower section using the skew chisel. And that's all the turning done. I sanded from 120 to 400 grit and cleaned it down with denatured alcohol, applied a good coat of sanding sealer, which was all denibbed with wire wool. And now for something new. For the final finish I decided to use chestnut friction polish, and I'm glad I did. I applied 3 coats in total and this gave a nice deep shine. I'll definitely be using this again. The clue to a good finish is in the name. I spun the lathe up so that it generated plenty of friction and heat to melt the polish into the surface. It has to be said, it's a strangely satisfying process. Okay, so it's more or less finished. Just need to part the base and a bit of sanding to finish. Now an admission. Whilst it looks okay, it isn't actually how it's supposed to look. I took too much off the outer diameter, which cut too deep into the pattern. If you look at the pictures at the end, the pattern where the Paduk meets the centre feature ring, the lines should meet with no gaps. So technically, this is a fail. But that will not put me off attempting this design again, and next time I'll do it better. with a proper way to set out the pattern, taking into account how much will need to be removed, and it will be a smaller version as this just used too much timber. So watch this space. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. This was a bit of a labour of love. It was over 1 month in the making with many technical difficulties along the way, but I got there in the end. Please don't forget to subscribe, a thumbs up will be great, and the comments are always welcome. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next one.